Good afternoon and evening. Welcome everybody to Rewind, the Shenson Retrospective Film Series put on by the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. My name is Shaina Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director for Jewish Studies, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this, the brainchild of Eitan Kensky, who is the Reinhardt Family Curator of Hebraica and Judaica at Stanford. And we also have Paloma Eisenberg here, who is a junior at Stanford in the Theater and Performance Studies program. And she is our undergraduate student director. I want to alert you to some forthcoming events before I introduce our special guest. One is, if you are an undergraduate at Stanford or know an undergraduate at Stanford, on March 7th at 4 p.m., we're hosting a watch party of Yentl. It's very important that everybody be exposed to this at least once. And so if you want information about that, you can find it on our website or send me an email. And then following that, on March 16th at 1:30, we're having a program called Adapting Jewish Literature, where we'll be talking about Yentl and A Tale of Love and Darkness with Rachel Kafrisen, remind me, Ruby Namdar and Fania Oz Salzberger. Am I saying her name correctly? Good, because I didn't write down everything on my Post-it. All of whom have investments in these movies, personal and otherwise, and will be a lively panel to discuss what it means to be an adaptation. Today, we're going to be talking about at least one film, actually multiple films that are themselves adaptations. With our wonderful guest, we're delighted to have Mark Harris. Mark is a writer and journalist for New York Magazine who's written many books about film, including Five Came Back, a story of Hollywood in the Second World War, and most recently, Mike Nichols' A Life, which is right behind Eitan if you take a look on display. It's had some marvelous reviews. It just came out, and I'm sure Eitan will speak about it as well, how terrific this book is. So welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. If you haven't been to one of these events before, here's how it's going to work today. Mark is going to share some background on the wonderful Joan Micklin-Silver, really important Jewish woman filmmaker, which is the theme of our whole series. And then we'll enter into a conversation about that. So during, at any point, you can go to the Q&A function and you can ask us a question for Mark or for any of us to consider, or even a comment, and we will share it at the appropriate time. So please do participate, because this is about all of us in conversation together. And with that, I put it over to Mark. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. And as Shaina said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about who Joan Micklin-Silver was and what she did. And then we'll turn it into more of a conversation. I thought if I were going to give this event a title, I would call it One More Problem We Don't Need, because that is what Joan Silver was told that she was when she was trying to get financing for what turned out to be her breakthrough film, her first full-length film, which was Hester Street. This came out at a time when really what we now call indies were so tiny in America so as not to be a real category. I mean, there wasn't a huge indie film movement in the US in the early or mid 1970s. There were John Cassavetes and a couple of other filmmakers, but not more than that, who were getting their films distributed at all. And when Joan Silver and her husband, Raphael Silver, who was also her producer, pitched this movie, this beautiful movie about the experience of immigrants trying or not trying to assimilate on the Lower East Side. What she was told was oh, movies are expensive. This is hard to market. It's Jewish. Are you sure you don't want to make it Italian instead? Because this was right in the wake of the Godfather movies and the rise of Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, and Italians were more bankable than Jewish characters. And finally, someone just bluntly told her, and you're a woman, and women directors are one more problem we don't need. So you have to cast yourself back into a world where it was not shocking for someone to say that to a person like Joan Micklin-Silver. And the reason that's important to know is that in so many ways, her career is defined and even circumscribed by that attitude. I mean, when you look at the work that she did, one thing that's really striking is that given the quality of it, given the reception of it, given the actors in it, there should have been more of it. She should have had a much fuller career than she did, and it's pretty hard to avoid the sense that had she not been a woman, doors would have opened that did not open. So to give you a little background on her, Joan Micklin-Silver is not, as many people thought she was, a native New Yorker. I think people who saw Hester Street and Crossing Delancey sort of assumed that the Lower East Side ran through her bloodstream, but she actually grew up in Omaha. Her parents were Russian Jewish immigrants who had made their way there, and she moved from there to Chicago at first with her family in the 1960s or perhaps 50s. She attended Sarah Lawrence College, and then she and her husband moved to New York. And I was always sort of moved by the fact that her entree into any kind of filmmaking was like basically educational short movies and film strips for schools. It's kind of the most unglamorous, short of industrial films, the most unglamorous way you can, get a toehold in the movie business. And it's also, I think, not by accident, something that would have been considered, women's work in the mid 1960s. It's like, well, she can't be a real filmmaker, but she can do this stuff for kids or for schools. And she had bigger ideas than that in mind, and more that she wanted to do. And that is what led to Hester Street, which, if you haven't seen it, I can't recommend this movie highly enough as this incredibly important milestone on several different roads. It's a milestone in Jewish filmmaking and filmmaking about the Jewish American experience. It's a milestone in the history of indie filmmaking in the mid 1970s, and it's a milestone for American women directors. This movie, which nobody would finance, so that Joan Silver's husband actually ended up raising the money himself, turned out to be a huge breakthrough. Carol Kane, the star of it, who was barely out of her teens at the time, was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress. She was only, I believe, the second actress in history at that time to be nominated for a movie that was directed by a woman. It hadn't happened since the third year of the Oscars, which was 1930 or 31. And more to the point, the movie was a big financial success, which was really quite unusual. I mean, it was black and white. It didn't have famous people in it, although it has someone who eventually became very famous, Doris Roberts, who everybody knows from Everybody Loves Raymond, shows up in a really wonderful part as a neighbor. But it really struck a chord with people and moved people, and was in every sense a breakthrough. And what's striking, of course, is that what she got out of that is nothing. She didn't get an offer for studio work. She didn't get an offer for a bigger budget. She was right back at square one after that. And when she came up with the idea for her next movie, which was something completely different, a film called Head Over Heels, nobody would finance it. And Head Over Heels is, a fascinating time capsule of a late 70s movie to look at. It's as different from Hester Street as you could imagine. It's about the sort of shaggy post-counterculture staff of an alternative weekly newspaper that was very much modeled after the Boston Phoenix.
It's Between the Lines.
Sorry, Between the Lines. Yes. And it has this great cast: John Hurd, Jeff Goldblum, a lot of young actors. She found very, very early in their careers, because that was one thing she was really good at, was spotting talent early on and kind of making the most of it. Peter Riegert, who she would work with again. And it's a really nice, it captures this particular generation that's just slightly after the kind of university uprising generation of the late 1960s. The sense that this generation was worried that it was slightly past the good years, the years where they could really do something and be activist and make a difference. So that movie was also a success, and she got closer then to making a studio movie with this her third film, which was called at different times Head Over Heels and Chilly Scenes of Winter. This by this point, the late 70s, we started to get the first quote unquote indie divisions of major studios. And so Chilly Scenes of Winter, which was an adaptation of an Anne Beatty story, sort of a love story, a romance without a happy ending. It's beautifully acted, it's beautifully observed, and again, she got kind of no leeway for it. At one point, it was essentially kind of taken away from her, retitled, and given a happy ending. And she had to spend a couple of years really fighting for her original vision of the movie and the original ending of the movie to be restored. And eventually she won. And the producers were her allies in this, including Griffin Dunn at the very beginning of his career. And the movie was re-released, got excellent reviews, was considerably better received than it had been when it was called Head Over Heels. And so finally, she gets to make a studio movie, Crossing Delancey, which is almost certainly her best known, indisputably her most widely seen movie. And again, in some ways coming full circle to Hester Street, a movie that belongs on any timeline of films about the American Jewish experience and the clash between assimilation and the old country, and the clash between tradition and modernity. It has this, I think, beautiful moment when Amy Irving, who's the heroine of the movie and who works in book publishing, is I believe she's talking to Peter Riegert, who is, of course, the hottest, sweetest pickle salesman in the history of movies, and he's on the Lower East Side, and she says something like, "Oh, well, I live on the Upper West Side, a million miles away," and that's sort of the theme of the movie. The Delancey, the street that she actually crosses, which is really, by the way, only a few blocks from Hester Street, is really, also a way of crossing neighborhoods, a way of crossing generations, a way of crossing from one set of traditions to a newer set of traditions. And the movie did really well and was very well received and quite popular with audiences. And then somewhat mysteriously, that was pretty much the end of her major filmmaking career. She did do I think one more feature film, and she did a number of cable movies for the rest of her career. Some of them quite well received. There's a movie called A Private Matter with Sissy Spacek that's about reproductive freedom. There's a film called Finnegan Begin Again with Mary Tyler Moore and Robert Preston. So she ended up by doing sort of middle to high end cable movies at a time when that was still a developing category. But I think when you look at her career, there's not much of a question that she did not have the opportunities that her male contemporaries had, but that she did make the most of the opportunity she had with work that we're still talking about. She passed away on the last day of 2020, and that I hope has sparked a reappreciation and a re-exploration of her work, and I hope people will continue to look at it and explore it. So that is my brief account of Joan Micklin-Silver, and now let's talk.
Mark, I want to thank you again for joining us today and for spending Purim with us. If you're on the East Coast, happy Purim. If you're anywhere else in the country, you have a few minutes to finish prepping your Hamantaschen. So originally, I would just want to give a little bit of background to today's discussion. Originally, when we came up with the schedule for our series, we grouped everything into kind of thematic double features. And we had two different Joan Micklin-Silver films that we wanted to look at. We wanted to look at Hester Street, and we wanted to look at Crossing Delancey. As you say, probably her two best known movies. And they were disconnected from each other. Crossing Delancey was paired with Desperately Seeking Susan under the idea of the comedy of Jewish assimilation in the 1980s. And Hester Street was paired with a much later movie, Romeo and Juliet in Yiddish, under the rubric of kind of turning to Yiddish. And so I'd like to start by maybe thinking about, those two poles for interpreting the work of Joan Micklin-Silver in some way. A return to Yiddish, a return to Lower East Side pickle culture, and maybe pickles as a rejection of kind of bad foreign fiction. So do you think that her work is nostalgic? Is it reaching for discarded traditions? Or is it better to say that it's more critical of what replaced some of these lost traditions?
I think it's actually, from my perspective, quite open-minded. Like revisiting the movies, which I did last month, I was struck by the fact that they're not reactionary. I mean, in Hester Street, I think her sympathies are absolutely with the character played by Carol Kane, rather than with her husband played by Stephen Keats, who really does seem to want to discard everything and just he wants more than anything to become an American, and for him that means shedding a certain aspect of his Jewish identity. But on the other hand, that story is also a story of Carol Kane's character coming into her power as a woman. I mean, she that marriage ends. She ends up sort of I think maybe a proto-feminist would be going too far, but she wants things, and she doesn't end up submitting to the will of someone else, and at the same time, I think there's compassion even extended to the character of her husband. I mean, Silver doesn't make it incomprehensible that he would want what he wants, because you can kind of understand it within the larger context of it being a matter of survival to him. He really thinks that the only way he can get ahead in the world is to become a new person and shed the old one. And obviously that's not a viewpoint that Silver shares, but it's not one she fails to understand. Also, I think it's interesting, I haven't read the source material that Hester Street is based on, which is a very old story that was written much closer to the time of the events in the film. But my understanding is that one thing that Silver did was to change the perspective of the story from male to female, that it really does become her story rather than his story. And that seems to me a step toward modernity as well.
I think that's right. And I also want to take this second to introduce my colleague, Shaina Hammerman, who is the author of Silver Screen, Hasidic Jews, The Story of an Image, which has an extensive discussion of Hester Street. So I'm very excited for Shaina to kind of jump in and pick up some of this discussion on Hester Street.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to jump in even without that. Thanks. Yeah, so one of the, hearing you talk about this clash between tradition and assimilation, or tradition and modernity, and thinking about these two films next to each other, there's a way to think about them as inversions of each other, right? In Hester Street, we have this woman's sort of measured move toward modernity, toward some kind of assimilation, right? She maintains her religiosity, but at the end of the film, the wig is gone. She wears the modern hairstyle, the modern dress. She sort of asserts her right for a divorce within the realm of legal Jewish practice. And so it's really kind of like, I mean, we can't really read the original book as a feminist treatise, but the film has this feminist lens to it, in the guise of this, classic Yiddish black and white film, right? And then Crossing Delancey does the inverted thing, where we have this modern woman, right, working woman, career woman, doesn't need a man, who takes this measured step toward a traditional married life with, we can think of it as the Jewish concept of the Basher, the fated one, towards this more traditional kind of man. And so these two women move in opposite directions, one towards assimilation and one towards tradition. And so I wonder if we can think of, rather than understanding these as a clash, as a kind of, Joan Micklin-Silver is sort of establishing this measured middle path of what does it mean to be a feminist, to be a woman, to assert your space in the world, and also to maintain the value of tradition. I mean, it's very second wave feminism to try and juggle those things which seem to be so much in opposition. And looking at the movies next to each other really drives that home, because there's something so traditional, so old-fashioned about the story presented in Crossing Delancey. But we're meant to see it as this modern, as you said, it's her first studio film too. So it's very sort of shiny in a way that Hester Street is not.
Right. I mean, it's a very produced movie. But I think one thing that I really like about it is that, Peter Riegert's character is much more traditional. He's almost, a fish out of water in the modern world, in a neighborhood that is itself a fish out of water in modern New York. But there's nothing in him that is trying to break Amy Irving's character. Like, he's not telling her that the things that she enjoys in life have no value or no meaning. What he's doing in his very quiet, very, I think, accepting way, is to say, this way, the way that I live, this more traditional way, has meaning to me, and I'm just going to kind of present it to you rather than impose it on you, and maybe let you come to it. So for me, it's not a movie that is about Amy Irving's character submitting so much as it is a movie about her character opening herself to a new possibility, while holding on to probably the stuff that she cares about and that is of value to her. I mean, one lovely thing about the movie, and you see this really in the performance of Reisel Bozic, who plays her grandmother, I guess, and also, the fantastic, insane scenery chewing of Sylvia Miles is that life, that more traditional life of matchmakers and yentas and arranged marriages and pickle selling, looks kind of juicy and fun. Those people are really alive. It's not presented in this kind of punitive, restrictive, forbidding way. So I was always really impressed by the fact that she was able to work those concerns into the framework of a 1980s studio romantic comedy.
You know what, you use the word juicy, and I think that we can think of juicy as being sexy, or we can think of it as being, as and appealing in some way, or we can think of it as being a little bit disgusting. And I think it kind of toggles between those two things, right? When we have the matchmaker sort of belching in her opening scene, we have the bubby, and she loses, intentionally puts her dentures in the guy's drink. I mean, there's a lot of sort of bodily stuff, chewing, hands in pickle jars, things that we see through Amy Irving's character's eyes as being a little bit unappealing. Like, she's really turned off by this.
Right.
And it's interesting. I wonder if, as the audience, we're also supposed to be turned off by it, or if, as you're saying, we're kind of invited into all of the sort of bodily, beautiful things of that world.
Well, we also see Amy Irving in her world, and it's one of those book publishing parties where, like, I guess everybody gets a glass of white wine, and maybe there's a tray of food passed around, but nobody really gets to eat. So in some ways, even though, it's a little bit the gross world of belching and dipping into things and chewing things, it's contrasted with what's shown as this modern world of its own kind of weird deprivation and austerity, where everybody's hungry and nobody gets to eat. So I think it's both things. I think it's a little kind of and also, it makes you hungry.
Maybe we can stay in that kind of austere world for a second of the book publishing. I recently talked about Crossing Delancey with a group of friends, and we found ourselves kind of wondering whether the movie was anti-intellectual, that the way they kind of present the writers, the way they present this literary world. I mean, I think the movie is unambiguous that the writer that she's attracted to, the man, is not a very good author, but also the poet that criticized him, her poetry is not actually very good. And it's unclear whether or not the movie wants us to think that the poetry is not that good. And Sam, at one point in the movie, though, he criticizes Izzy for judging him as being too provincial, that his world is too provincial. So I'm kind of wondering, do you think maybe that's a better frame for thinking about it, that the movie is, anti-cosmopolitan, in some sense?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I really do. I think in some ways, it's a 1980s studio romantic comedy that draws on decades of tradition about a kind of tightly wound city woman needing to, have her resistance slowly worn down, and also realizing that she lives in a false world, a world of pretensions and misplaced priorities and people who think they're better than they are. And particularly in the 1980s themselves, I mean, there were all these, I think of all these TV shows that, like LA Law and like Moonlighting, where there was kind of an ice queen, not ever a Jewish woman. They were always very waspy, like Sybil Shepherd and Susan Day at the center of these things. But there was real recommitment in the 1980s to the romantic arc of a woman is this thing that needs to be thought out and broken down, and shown that all of the reinforcements she's put up against things that have made her brittle are things that she doesn't really need if the right earthy guy comes along. I do think that Crossing Delancey also draws on that particular trope and tradition.
On Crossing Delancey, I wanted to ask, why do you think a movie like that is still so relevant today? And like, I watched it for the series and I loved it.
I feel like I would honestly rather hear from women on this subject because the biggest Crossing Delancey fans that I encounter are all women, and it's probably not for me to analyze what works so well about that movie for generations that weren't born when it was made. I'm not sure. I mean, it's I do think one thing about it is that the male romantic lead is not a bully. He's not this alpha guy. He's very, very sure of who he is, but he's not aggressive about it. He's always respectful of her, even when he challenges her. And I think that's that. I think if that weren't true, you'd groan at the movie in a way that you don't now when you watch it.
Totally. Yeah.
I think so. I'll take a stab. Let me speak for all women. Women attendees, put your thoughts in the Q&A. Men too. I think that there's a certain kind of appeal to the way that this relationship bears out. On the one hand, it is, like I called it before, a sort of fated, a Basheret relationship, because the older generation selects these two people to be together. They're Jews, they belong together, right? So much more so than her and that, the bad author. There's something fated in their love, and at the same time, it's presented as her choice. She also chooses it. So you get fate and choice at the same time. And Nomi Seidman has written about this, about the classic Yiddish play, the Dybbuk, which has the same sort of sense of they fall in love with each other, and little did they realize their fathers had shaken hands when they were born, that they belonged together, right? So you get the tradition and you get the modernity at the same time. And there's something very romantic about getting both of those things presented to the viewer.
Yeah, I think the tradition is also presented as slightly appealingly exotic. Like it is a different world that she can step into, and it's not just this world of pews and prayers. It's as we said before, juicy. There's a whole culture that Peter Riegert is a part of, that in a way Sylvia Miles is also a part of, even though like they couldn't be further apart in terms of their personalities or their approach to things. So what it offers Amy Irving's character is a doorway into a world, not just an exit from her old life or a giving up of things, but I think this is very hard to do with movies about religious tradition in any kind of convincing way. But what the movie does and it does it within a genre, which is even harder, is it suggests that your world could get bigger if you open yourself up to traditional things. That's a really hard argument for a movie to make, and it's almost an argument you never see mainstream movies make it. So I think that's one thing that sets the film apart from a lot of other work, and maybe one reason it's lasted as long as it has in the hearts of people who see it is there haven't been a lot of movies like that have made that same argument and have made it without sounding argumentative about it.
I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to tease out this idea of nostalgia and whether or not her movies were kind of nostalgic, because I think that it's not necessarily longing per se for what had been, but it's kind of a questioning of maybe what has been lost. You say it's not reactionary. I think that's right, but it's not. But it's perhaps coming from a place of recognition that something has faded away. You know, in encountering Sam and going into his world, she obviously sees something so new that, you know, it seemed provincial, but actually her world had been just as provincial before. She runs around the track, he plays racquetball in the park, but otherwise they're kind of living parallel, disconnected universes. But once she really engages with him, the whole city opens up. Suddenly she can be in a Gray's Papaya or Papaya King, hearing Run DMC on boomboxes, and all of a sudden a Broadway star is going to come in and start belting out show tunes. It's just the entire city ends up taking on this kind of magical quality after you allow yourself to open up a little bit more.
Right. I mean, it is one of the classic, like, here is how you fall in love with New York City movies. You know, that scene where the Broadway star comes in and sings. It's like, I'm sure that's inspired some people to move to New York, you know, because it's really presented as this magical place where stuff like that can happen. But you know, you use the word nostalgia, and I think that's a really interesting complicated theme throughout her work, because if you go back to Hester Street, you know, the missing main character of that movie that you never see, but that is absolutely there, is the old world, the world that they have had to leave behind. You feel Carol Kane's ache for what she's left behind. And you know, a lot of her performance is almost wordless, but in everything she does, you realize that it has cost her something really dear to her to walk away from the past. And then even in as different context as Between the Lines, there's nostalgia for something much more recent. There's this you get this slight sense on the part of this kind of goofy, struggling, haven't quite gotten their lives together, but know they're old enough that they should get their lives together, group of misfits at this paper, that they maybe missed the good stuff, or are just past the good stuff, or that there was a more exciting world that they've either aged out of or were born too late for. So I think always there's this little kind of melancholy undertow in her work of just awareness that the past is in our bones, you know, in our blood, and that it costs us something to give it up or turn our backs on it or pretend that it isn't a part of who we are.
Maybe that's a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about tone and whether or not you feel like she has any kind of distinctive tones as a filmmaker and how she approaches things. You know, thinking about Between the Lines, the first time that I saw that movie, I actually thought it was very slight. It was just kind of, you know, walking through the lives of these people at this Boston Phoenix-like newspaper. And I lived in Boston for about 12 years, so I loved getting to see the city back in more of its dirty old town phase. But I watched it again a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this, and this time I thought it was very intensely critical. That there's a line early in the film that the people who work at the paper are either on their way up or on their way out. And then for the rest of the movie, we're being asked to evaluate all of them and to decide, you know, which is it? Are they on their way up or on their way out? So do you think that as a filmmaker, she has a specific tone? Is it more adaptable to the source material? Is it something where your initial impression might be one thing and then you realize it's something else entirely?
You know, this is always tricky to talk about with the work of directors who mainly do not write their own movies. I went through this working on the Mike Nichols biography to try to tease out themes. Can be really complicated in a way that it isn't as complicated for writer directors. But yeah, I do think that she is. I think she expresses great warmth toward her characters and their plights, while also holding on to the idea that their plights are very often of their own making. She's not a cruel filmmaker in any way, but I think the stuff that attracted her is things that cast a fairly honest eye on the compromises that people have to make as they go through life. I mean, I'm always struck when I saw Between the Lines this time. I thought for the first time, I thought maybe this is a movie that was really a few years ahead of its time, because if you jump forward from, I think, 77, which is when this was released, 77 or 78, to like the early to mid 80s, things like The Big Chill and 30 something really started to explicitly explore, like, okay, what happens when yesterday's idealist becomes today's yuppie sneaker salesman, you know? And it's partly a function of age, and it's partly a function of moving into what was widely seen as a more acquisitive decade, you know, moving from the sort of swinging 70s to the Reagan years. But I think that Silver in some ways got there first with Between the Lines. I think that, you know, the movie doesn't entirely have its head around what's about to happen, but as you said, it knows that something is about to happen. Like that line, they're either on their way up or on their way out. She knows that culturally we're hitting some kind of fork in the road. And she doesn't know quite what it's going to be yet, but it's really pretty impressive that she identified it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think actually it's even more so, because one of the things that happens is there's a character who's kind of writing a book about the end of the counterculture. And he's discussing it at a dinner, and his interlocutor is just kind of pricing it. What did you get for your advance? He describes the book a little bit more. Oh no, you only got this amount of money. It's the sense that they've already figured out that it's gone. People have already started to write about it, but no one's done it in a way that's truly compelling. So it all feels kind of just within this one track. And what comes after it, you know, is unknown. That the swingingness of the 70s has actually disguised the fact that a lot of the thrust to that generation has faded away.
Right, and there aren't many American movies from that early that have their eye on that change that's happening. It's pretty prescient in that way.
So since you brought up this idea of kind of how do you evaluate a lot of these filmmakers who didn't write their own screenplays, or, you know, try and understand the kind of the tone and the overall sense, it's even more so with Joan Micklin-Silver, because so many of her movies are actually adaptations of literary works.
Right.
So we have Hester Street coming from Ab Khan's Jekyll, Chilly Scenes of Winter being from the short story, Bernice Bobs Her Hair being from the Fitzgerald short story, Crossing Delancey being a play. Why do you think that she was so drawn to adaptation and interpretation of earlier material? And do you think that being an interpretive filmmaker has maybe actually harmed her kind of critical reputation?
That's a really interesting notion. I wonder if there is something to be said about directors who work primarily on adaptations sort of being seen as not having a strong perspective of their own. I mean, to the extent that people see that, it's very unfair. And I also think it's, again, you know, if there's that double distance of it's an adaptation and the adaptation was written by someone else, we're more in some ways inclined to downgrade the director than we would be, for instance, I mean, the Coen brothers, No Country for Old Men is an adaptation, but it feels 100% like a Coen brothers movie because we understand that they have a particular sensibility. But again, this is an area where the fact that Silver wasn't given more opportunities and more chances means that we're trying to draw conclusions about her interests and passions based on a body of work that is artificially truncated because of the social context in which she was or was not given opportunities. Like if she had gotten to make 12 feature films, who knows what those other 8 would have been, and wouldn't it be fascinating to look at these 4 within the context of everything that followed? I mean, who knows how we would understand her work if she'd gotten the chance to just continue on as any man who had put together the run of films that she did would have gotten.
I think about that question of adaptation, without changing the story very much in Hester Street from the book, the novella Jekyll, which, as you mentioned earlier, it's really a story about the husband. What she did, namely, I'd say in casting Carol Kane, was completely shift the appeal of Giddle, of that character. As you said, she said so much of the film is her silence, right? It's just her big naive eyes and her sort of quiet looks, and so much happens in that silence. The Giddle in the book is loud and brash, and she's constantly shouting curses, Yiddish curses of all kinds. Also, importantly, the book is written originally in English, and the film then is adapted into Yiddish. So that's another way that it's kind of made into something. That's a kind of nostalgia game that Joan Micklin-Silver is playing there. So on the one hand, she changes certain things in particularly in the perspective and who we're empathizing with the most, and in the type of woman that we see, but also in making it feel authentic, right? Like what we're watching is a document. And I've read some stuff Joan Micklin-Silver wrote about or spoke about setting up this Lower East Side so that it really was as authentic as she could afford to make it in this very low budget film. And my favorite, I told this to Eitan earlier, one of my favorite anecdotes is that they spray painted the horse. So it looked like there was more than one horse. There was a white horse and then a brown horse.
Amazing.
Yeah. So she was making a lot of choices, and I think it's true that, yeah, we can't really tell overall the way that the Coen brothers films are so marked by their tone and style. We can't say that for her necessarily, but we can look into these choices that a filmmaker makes in adaptation to sort of expose what they're trying to get at or what they're seeing from the source material.
Yeah, and you touched on something that I think really is a signature of hers, and a good example of what a director who doesn't write can still do to put her own imprint on a movie. That Giddle is, as you said, a loud, brash character on the page of the story, but in the movie, Silver really creates space, visual space for her to think, and for us to watch her observing things, mulling things over, considering things. She's often like not huge in the frame, so you're seeing her physically in the context of the new world she's in, whether it's freeing, like down a street, or a room that she feels trapped in. We get to watch her not talk, but work things out in her mind. And I think on a much glossier level, she also does that with Amy Irving in Crossing Delancey. She'll often kind of, you'll see Amy Irving trapped in a particular space if she's feeling very oppressed by her sort of overbearing ancestors, if she's feeling lost at a party. You like, this is a character who's quite anxious. It's a story in some ways about a woman who's really determined not to do what she ends up deciding to do, that she resists for a long time. And I don't think it would work if Silver had just made her an object of fun, but by giving Amy Irving room to be quiet, to seem frustrated, to look a little lost, to listen while other people talk, and you can imagine what's going through her head. It really centers her in the movie in a kind of meaningful way, and I think Silver's willingness to let us watch her characters think and work things through silently is definitely a signature that carries through from movie to movie.
So I want to encourage people to start leaving comments in the Q&A or in the chat so that we can get some questions from the audience. In the meantime, Mark, since you're one of our leading film historians, I want to ask you a couple of maybe contextual questions. So Shaina mentioned the fact that with Hester Street, it comes out in the context of second wave feminism. That's one of the contexts for this movie. And that was really heightened for me watching Bernice Bobs Her Hair, where we have kind of similar project of using the early 20th century and a period of, with that movie, actual first wave feminism, with Hester Street, something beforehand, to make a comment on the present day and maybe feminism in its moment. But there's another big context for Hester Street beyond independent film, which you mentioned, which is it's this period of kind of Jewish American filmmakers really opening up and confronting their identity on film, a period, a time that's sometimes referred to as the Jew wave. So I'm thinking of people like Paul Mazursky, early Sidney Lumet movies, also movies like, Carnal Knowledge, which you obviously write about in this book. How do you think Hester Street, fits in with that group of Jew wave filmmakers who are mostly men? What do you think it's doing that's the same or that's different in some way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess that was also the time of like the apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, and
yeah, there's a bunch of the literary adaptations of Goodbye Columbus, Portnoy's Complaint.
Yeah, and so many of those that have male protagonists are like growth stories. Like it's somebody wants something and they figure out a way to get it and they get it, or they have a bunch of experiences and they come through them and then they become like themselves. But it's usually very much about their agency. It's not a lot about what happens to them. As much, I mean, it is in some ways, certainly Portnoy's Complaint, but they're not quiet characters. They're rarely passive characters, and it's interesting to think of Hester Street as a kind of outlier in that category, because almost none of the other movies that you named, well, none of them are directed by women, and I mean, I guess the exception there would be, I'm thinking of The Heartbreak Kid.
Yeah, I was going to ask you next about Elaine May and how you would compare Joan Micklin-Silver to Elaine May.
There's a really sort of interesting unspoken relationship there, I think. I mean, there's an odd coincidence in that Silver almost got her big break a couple of years before Hester Street by rewriting a movie called Such Good Friends that was eventually directed by Otto Preminger, and then she was fired and replaced by Elaine May. So they were sort of slightly living in the same universe, although their aesthetics were wildly different. I mean, Elaine May also directed 4 major features that now constitute the sort of core of her directorial work. So that's something she has in common with Silver, but she was a writer to her marrow. So the way she approached stories was very different. I mean, she felt completely comfortable with script writing. I mean, she's among other things one of the most famous uncredited writers in Hollywood. So I think one distinction between them is that May really knew how to put words in the mouths of her characters. And Silver, I didn't hear any stories along the way of her saying to the actors, what if you said this? What if this is how you put it. She was very respectful of writers, and didn't think her job was to override them or rewrite them. But yeah, it's interesting to think about her in the context of that particular era that you're talking about. You know, it's slightly odd to talk about her filmography because you don't get much less Jewish than an Anne Beatty story, and so, you know, we're drawing this connection between her first movie and her fourth movie, which are, you know, more than a decade apart, and it's hard sometimes to put those in the same world as the movies she made in between.
Yeah, it's kind of a recurring theme and topic that she came back to. And Jeff Goldblum in Between the Lines is a very obviously Jewish character who drops some Yiddish words. And at one point he's having a contract dispute he's trying to get more money, and he asks for time off for Passover, you know, in terms of when he goes to his boss. So it is something that she went back to. And I think her last feature film is with Jerry Stiller and Ann Mira. You know, it's striking what you said to me about Elaine May, because when we spoke to Susan Teidelman a few weeks ago, one thing that she mentioned, and a point that she reiterated, is that there really weren't other women directors in the time whose work she was following. You know, she said she looked to Europe and to people like Lena Wertmuller and, you know, Chantal Ackerman, and that them being the kind of the reference for her, that really it was only Elaine May who was making movies at this time. So I guess I'm curious about how we place Joan Micklin-Silver and who are her contemporaries, and do we feel as if her work is really being in dialogue with anyone else?
I mean, I think calling her a Jew wave filmmaker is one fair context to place her in. I mean, but there at the same time, there was always something kind of diffident about her as a filmmaker. I mean, she does seem to stand off to the side of what was going on in the mainstream of movies. Like all of her movies are in different ways anomalies. You know, Hester Street was, I mean, it was a real hit, and it was a hit at a time when that meant, you know, it played in New York theaters for several months. Like, it really hung on, and in a number of other cities as well. But it was also this oddity, you know, this black and white movie by a woman, you know, about Jewish immigrants. Like, to place it in the year of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Dog Day Afternoon. I mean, yes, it was a New York movie, but it wasn't a New York movie like Dog Day Afternoon, you know. It's I think one of the really hard things historically about the fact that there were so few women making movies that got seen is that we're only now, decades later, kind of beginning to piece that together as a category. I mean, the movie Barbara Loden directed, Wanda, you know, which is like a really remarkable film from the 1970s. This is basically forgotten for decades until it was rescued by the Criterion Collection, and now a new generations of people are beginning to know it. But whatever, I fear that whatever world we're trying to place her in is a world that we're slightly retrospectively inventing, rather than a world that really existed, because she didn't really have mentors. She didn't really have colleagues. You know, she didn't really have access to the teeming world of filmmaking that would create influences and things like that. She worked on her own, or, you know, her husband had to go out and, who was incredibly supportive, had to go out and find financing for her movies. So in some ways she was deprived of the context that is one thing that we use to enrich our understanding of male filmmakers.
Yeah, that is one of the, a similar point is made in that book, Liberating Hollywood, that came out a few years ago, about kind of women filmmakers in this time period, that they're really disconnected and making movies for themselves. There's not really a dialogue going on between them. I know we have a hand raised from the audience, but I want to ask you one other question beforehand. One thing that became clear to us, and you've already referenced this when we were putting together the series, is how many of these filmmakers also worked in television for an extensive amount of time. And that some cases they directed series, and in other cases they worked, as in Joan Micklin-Silver, really worked on TV movies. And I'm wondering how much you feel like this might have been a lifestyle choice, or particularly with the case of Joan Micklin-Silver, it strikes me that this could have been an opportunity to cast actresses of a certain age and work with really talented people who might not otherwise have been, able to appear in a Hollywood feature. So say working with Mary Tyler Moore in Finnegan Begins Again, or having Sissy Spacek as the lead in A Private Matter, or working with Gina Rowlands and Mimi Rogers, in Charms for an Easy Life. It seems that in some ways TV was an opportunity to be able to tell different types of women-centric storytelling.
I think it certainly was, particularly in those years when there was even less opportunity than there is now to have those films be theatrically released. But we should be honest about the fact that it was also a step down. I mean, now there is much more seamless moving back and forth for filmmakers, for actors, for talent between movies and television. I think nobody looks at Nicole Kidman, for instance, and says, oh God, she has to do miniseries. I guess she can't get a movie part anymore. Like, that's just not the way things work anymore. But one reason you don't see a lot of male filmmakers from the late 1980s and early 1990s suddenly shifting to cable is that they didn't have to. That was a move you made when your feature film opportunities dried up. And I think, within that, there's no question that Silver had more opportunities to do interesting work in television and to work with those interesting actresses who clearly had seen her work. And, if you look at her body of cable TV work, it wasn't just like she wasn't an assignment director who was just taking whatever she was handed. She was particularly interested in women's stories and working with actresses. So I think she did get to script her own career a little bit more than she had opportunity to do theatrically. But at the same time, she got to do that because really for no particularly good reason, another door was closed to her.
So I think Shaina is going to manage some questions that we have from the audience and call on people.
So one of our attendees writes that Amy Irving was married to Steven Spielberg when Crossing Delancey came out. What was missing in Joan Micklin-Silver's personal makeup that she wasn't able to leverage that connection to keep making films? So this is on that same sort of note. It's an extremely tough business, but I'm having a problem with the premise that because of her gender, she was unable to fulfill her potential.
Well, I think it's a much greater leap to say that she had some sort of character deficiency that prevented her from using her leading lady's husband to get jobs than to suggest that, yeah, gender had a lot to do with it, especially given that there's no shortage of evidence that she was told by men that gender had a lot to do with it. I mean, and if gender didn't have a lot to do with it, why aren't we talking about 100 different women directors from that period? I mean, bias in the industry was absolutely a factual reality back then. I mean, it is now, but as much as it is now, it was exponentially more so in the 1970s and 1980s. So I have no idea what her relationship with Spielberg was or wasn't, but I do know, because I wrote about her soon after she died, that the actors she worked with spoke of her incredibly warmly and respectfully. I mean, in particular, the people who Griffin Dunn, who produced Chilly Scenes of Winter with two other people, two other actors, said Silver was the experienced one. She treated us incredibly kindly because she knew much more about filmmaking than we did, and we felt really that she was an incredibly generous person. And you know, actors, the fact that she worked with John Hurd more than once, who was notoriously not an easy actor to work with, speaks, I think, pretty well for her ability to maintain relationships. So I do point to gender as probably a really significant factor in this, just because I think it's an Occam's razor thing. I mean, if the shortest distance between 2 points is often the obvious, you know, answer, the idea that she didn't have as many opportunities because she was a woman is right there.
Thanks. Paloma has a question about you, Mark.
Yeah, I have a question about your background. So you're the executive editor of Entertainment Weekly, and I was wondering, was there a movie or show, play, musical, or anything that you watched growing up that sparked your love of whether film, entertainment? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I loved movies from the time I could see them. I mean, I remember the first movie I saw was Pinocchio, and I guess more what I vividly remember was sort of watching movies in the worst possible way on TV after school. There was this thing called the 4:30 movie, where movies were filled with commercials and all of the adult parts were edited out, and they were divided into two parts. Like a movie would air part one on Monday and part two on Tuesday, even if the movie was only like 2 hours long. So the worst possible way to see movies, and I loved them anyway. And the only other thing is that my parents were, my father was a big movie fan, but my parents were a little strict. So I got to see like my first PG rated movie and my first R rated movie a year or two after all of my friends did. And those were years of intense longing to understand what was in the adult world that only movies could show me. And so I think in some ways I never got over that. I never stopped feeling that movies had interesting secrets about the world to tell me. But I don't think there was one film necessarily that triggered my love for movies.
So Mark, we're going to start wrapping up the formal program. And I want to maybe ask you one last question first, which is that Hester Street and Crossing Delancey are probably the best known of her films, but which other ones would you recommend to the people in the audience who want to go deeper?
Well, I would certainly recommend the other two that we talked about, Between the Lines and Chilly Scenes of Winter. And, you know, if you do a little more digging, this film, A Private Matter, which I think was made for HBO in the early 90s with Sissy Spacek, is quite lovely. And I don't know that it officially streams anywhere, but, you know, if you were to go look for it on YouTube or Vimeo and it happened to be there, lucky you. Not that I would ever tell you to do that, but you know.
Yes, Hester Street's in a similar position right now, although that was recently restored by UCLA and I believe the rights were purchased by Cohen Media Group. So at some point there will be a nice new version of Hester Street for us to watch.
Right. That's really a relief, because, you know, the problem with all these movies from the 70s or 80s that were released by tiny independent companies or self-distributed is they really can get lost in terms of streamability. So when a company, like a good company like Cohen Media Group, picks up you know, something like Hester Street, it's a guarantee that eventually it's going to have a life. And boy, do not miss the opportunity to see that movie if it's ever presented to you. It's really a beautiful film.
Yeah, I think it'll just be a matter of time. So, Mark, I want to thank you again for joining us today to talk about Joan Micklin-Silver. It is a Purim miracle. What can you say? As Shaina mentioned, we have more events coming up in this series, so please stay tuned for updates. Thank you, everyone, for coming and asking questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.